Hello again, everybody. Lance Russell and Dave Brown right along ringside. By golly, we're about ready to go with more big action.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm Gordon Solie, your host, and we have quite an hour in store for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Championship Wrestling at ringside. This is Vince McMahon, along with wrestling's only living legend, Bruno Sammartino.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mid-South Wrestling Television. I'm your host, Boyd Pierce, another outstanding card.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Regional Rasslin Podcast, where we talk the territories. I am Ray Russell, and this week, it's yet another new project in the new year, and that means another new special guest co-host as we discuss the topic of pro wrestling in Chicago, most specifically 1966 to 1983, the Dick the Bruiser, Verne Gagne, Wilbur Snyder era of promoting. But we'll also talk a little, no doubt, about Fred Kohler and things of that nature as we go along. But in order to do all of that, we're going to welcome onto the show his very first time here, the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. I am very proud to welcome to the Regional Rasslin Podcast, the one and only, the author of the book Bruiser, the world's most dangerous wrestler. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Vicek to the program.
Nice to be here, Ray. And I'm going to tell the people about an interesting chapter in the history of wrestling, the Chicago Wrestling Club, which covers 1966 to 1983.
Yeah, there's plenty of history there. A lot of people don't realize, Richard, that Chicago was a territory. I mean, they knew there were shows in Chicago, but they didn't realize it was kind of its own entity with a mixture of both the AWA, the WWA. We're going to get into a lot of that today, I'm sure. But I'm excited because this is one of those territories not a lot of people spend time to dive into and really dissect and discuss. And I'm happy to have you on the program to begin that.
And I'm happy to share this experience because for those years, from 1966 to 83, several times a year, I actually went to the International Amphitheater or White Sox Park to see these cards. And you know, I never missed a week of television, which were usually on Sunday mornings. Okay. And, you know, so it was a wonderful experience for me.
Wow. So a firsthand experience is what we're going to have here. Not just somebody quoting out of books and doing a lot of digging in history. Nothing wrong with doing research. I do it all the time, but firsthand experience beats anything in my eyes. And so I can't wait to get your take on a lot of things, not just from a historical point of view, but a fan point of view. So that's going to be really fun. Well, I guess so. I guess we can jump right into things here. I know you kind of did an outline for me, and I greatly appreciate that. Steve Crawford did that for me with the 77 show we're working on right now in Memphis. And so I guess I'll let you get kicking off. I guess we're titling this episode The Introduction. We're sort of setting the stage here on this episode.
Well, Chicago Wrestling Club was a combination of forces. First, the American Wrestling Association, AWA from Minneapolis, and the World Wrestling Association, WWA, from Indianapolis. And the controllers were Verne Gagne from the AWA and Dick the Bruiser, plus Wilbur Snyder from the WWA. And I thought they presented a powerhouse lineup, a lot of Hall of Fame caliber talent that was second to none. And I realized, you know, I don't know how objective I am because that was the wrestling promotion I grew up with.
Right.
But, you know, I spent a lot of time following other promotions through the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Every week I'd get a VHS tape of WMC TV in Memphis. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I would get on cable, follow the WWF on cable out of Secaucus, New Jersey, and USA Network, and what started on WTBS, Georgia Championship Wrestling, which evolved into World Championship Wrestling. So I got a lot of exposed to a lot of other stuff too. But you know, let's talk about the Chicago Wrestling Club. Yeah. Besides those three bosses that I talked about, here are the people that were mainstays for the Chicago Wrestling Club.
Okay.
Bockwinkel, Stevens, Heenan, the Crusher, the Vachons, Dr. X, who a lot of people would know as the Destroyer.
Right, Dick Beyer, yeah.
Larry Hennig, Bobo Brazil, the original Sheik, Harley Race, Billy Robinson, Jim Brunzell, Greg Gagne, Adonis, Ventura, Lanza, Mulligan, Baron von Raschke, Superstar Billy Graham, Pat Patterson, Dusty Rhodes, Dick Murdoch, Bruiser Brody, Ivan Koloff, Bruno Sammartino, Ernie Ladd, Dr. Moto, who is Tor Kamada in a lot of other circles, Mitsu Arakawa, the Valiant Brothers, Johnny Valentine, and more. So what we'll be doing today, we will talk about the rise and fall of the Chicago Wrestling Club.
Love it.
And we'll break it up into the three main decades.
Okay.
1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. And we'll review business developments and the notable cards and the hottest in-ring rivalries.
If you were kind enough to send me over the results for much of 1966 to 1983, if not all of the results. And so yes. I'll be scrolling along as you discuss things and just kind of, if anything piques my interest, I'll bring it up to you and see if you have any idea or just any memories or even thoughts on anything. But in general, I'm going to step back at this point, guys, and just let Richard give us the 411 here.
Well, the background for the Chicago Wrestling Club actually started before 1966, where I'm sure any wrestling history buff knows the name Fred Kohler.
Oh, yeah.
Kohler, 1903 to 1969. He first promoted wrestling at the International Amphitheater and the Marigold Arena in 1949. And he produced the Dumont TV National Wrestling TV program from 1949 to 1955.
And that was how all of the names involved, like a Verne Gagne and whatnot, the guys that were on that Dumont Network show, that's how they became basically national stars, even though they were performing more local to the Chicago area.
Yeah. I mean, on those shows, he had Rocca and Schmidt and Fez and Snyder and Buddy Rogers and Bruiser and Haystacks Calhoun. By the way, you could watch the development and history of this Fred Kohler promotion on YouTube under the auspices of the Chicago Film Archives.
Oh, yeah. Good
on
stuff
YouTube,
there.
Where there's 110 full-length matches in black and white, excellent video quality. And the name of the entrepreneur for those programs, his name was Russ Davis. He's also the ring announcer for these.
Okay.
So that's on YouTube, covering roughly 1950 to 1961. And by 1961, Kohler was co-promoting cards with Vince McMahon Sr.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't know if you have this information. I'm sure you do, Richard, but I believe Eddie Quinn was a promoter up there in Montreal, and he had come down. If I remember correctly, he come down and tried to start running shows, maybe kind of push Kohler out or see what he could do there. And is that what led to the joint promotion or the joint co-promoting with Vince Sr.?
I think that was a factor because Eddie Quinn started promoting at the Chicago Stadium, not the amphitheater.
Right.
And, of course, the Chicago Stadium was the home of the Chicago Blackhawks, a very historic 18 or 19,000 seat indoor venue. For a while, it was the largest indoor arena in the United States.
Okay.
And Eddie Quinn tried promoting there for a couple of years, and they did their program on a CBS TV affiliate in Chicago at the time. So yes, that was one of the earliest invasions, I guess you'd call.
Sure, yeah.
You talk about that.
Seems unusual for that time, especially two shows having TV. I would imagine they both have TV at that point. If Eddie Quinn's coming in and doing CBS, I'm imagining that even though the Dumont Network folds, I know they stay on WGN for a few more years, did the original run there before that was canceled in the late 50s.
And the WGNs, the play-by-play announcer was a very prominent baseball announcer named Jack Brickhouse.
Oh, yeah.
Who people in later decades would see when the Chicago Cubs were on national cable TV. he was the announcer before Harry Carey.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Jack Brickhouse, legendary announcer, but every once in a while when WCW signed a deal with WGN to air their version of a syndicated pro to the WGN network later on, every once in a while they would bring Jack Brickhouse on for a little segment on there as well. So it's kind of cool to see full straight little paying homage, to the legends of yesteryear as far as being around the business. So I love the fact that he was kind of incorporated into that.
But, with just about every wrestling entrepreneur, sometime you run out of steam. Not as people watch your show, not as many people show up at the arena. In business, you develop enemies. Whatever happens, that happened to Fred Kohler. And in 1964, Kohler brought in two partners, minority business partners, William Franklin Afflis, whose ring name was Dick the Bruiser, and Wilbur Everard Snyder. Both of them were former football players. Afflis with the Green Bay Packers, and Afflis started wrestling in 1956, and Snyder played for the Edmonton Eskimos in Canada, and he started wrestling in 1953. So that same year, Snyder and Bruiser started the company Championship Wrestling of Indiana in Indianapolis, with both of their wives and Bruiser's mother as the officers of the company.
Yeah.
I understand years ago, you couldn't have a wrestling promoters. You couldn't hold a wrestler's license and a promoter's license simultaneously. So in that case, the ladies were the officers on paper. And so for the 1964 to 65, they were partners with Kohler and appeared on a lot of his shows. Eventually, they started catching on because, those guys, Snyder and Bruiser, from roughly 1960 to mid-1964, they did not appear on cards for Kohler. So they almost had to start from scratch again, developing a following, all that kind of stuff. So now we're into 1965, and Kohler wants to retire. And another wrestling star is brought into the situation, Verne Clarence Gagne, who played college football in Minnesota, started wrestling in 1949, and formed the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club with partner Wally Carbo.
Oh, okay. They go all the way back to 60, him and Carbo. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, Gagne was wrestling
right
in Minnesota for the previous owner.
Okay.
Wally Carbo worked for the Stecker family. So he was always involved with the wrestling scene in Minnesota. And they were known as the American Wrestling Association. And Gagne eventually became one of the most prominent AWA heavyweight champions in the 1960s.
Right.
And one thing that Gagne is, I think, most responsible for is the training of, it has to be dozens or scores of wrestlers. Ric Flair, Ken Patera, Sergeant Slaughter, Jim Brunzell, Ricky Steamboat. The names just go on and on and on for AWA contribution, where, that is just a stellar legacy to the wrestling industry. And as much as a Dick the Bruiser fanatic I was, he didn't do anything like that. There may be some wrestlers that got their starts there, but Gagne had hand-on training that provided a basis for all those wrestlers and more. So anyway, in late 1964, a new company was incorporated in the state of Illinois, the Chicago Wrestling Club, Inc. There were two owners of that company. First was Robert A. Luce.
Bob Luce. I recognize that name, Richard.
Was a longtime photographer and publicist for Kohler. Kohler was the man behind the Wrestling Life magazine from 1954 to 1960. I mean, the mailing address for that magazine was Kohler's office.
Okay.
on Grace Street in the Wrigley Field neighborhood of Chicago. Anyway, Luce was one partner. The other one was a longtime Midwest wrestling promoter named Buddy Lee Clift, who frequently promoted cards in Rockford, Illinois, Peoria, Illinois, and the Quad Cities, which include Davenport, Bettendorf, Rock Island, and Moline. There's these 4 cities that border the Mississippi River. But Cliff was married to the niece of Mary Gagne. In other words, Cliff's father-in-law was the brother of Mary Gagne, Verne's wife.
Okay, Verne. Yeah, I was going to say that was the wife of Verne. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, so that's the connection there. And so you see that there's representatives in that ownership for both people.
Right.
For both AWA and WWA.
Right.
Of course, they knew who's going to make all the decisions. What 3 guys are going to make all the decisions of who wrestles and what happens at the International Amphitheater. And they had their debut card, the Chicago Wrestling Club, on January 8th, 1966, at the International Amphitheater.
So basically, new year, new promotion. We're ready to roll here, huh? Okay. I like it.
And all 3 owners were headliners on that card.
Normally, I would make a joke and say, imagine that, but given the stars involved, I can't really discredit the fact that these guys are headlining.
I had no idea. It wasn't until 8 or 9 years later where a spot promoter woke me up to the business.
Oh, you broke kayfabe on
with the ownership on the ownership
right,
parts.
Right.
And I was already a freshman in college. He was doing a spot show for the WWA. He says, "Well, don't you know Bruiser and Snyder and Gagne? They're the ones that called the. That's who I met. I had to meet with them to get them to agree to let me put on the spot show."
Okay. So before we go too far, Richard, I have another question for you. I don't want to take you off topic, though. I don't want to throw you off.
That's okay. No, anytime.
So I want to just go back to those other names you mentioned. Of course, Bob Luce, legendary, infamous figure in the Chicago wrestling world, but and then Buddy Lee Clift. Now, what would they have been at this point in time with Verne and Afflis and Snyder running the show? What were Luce and Buddy Lee in charge of? What were their roles right now?
Luce took care of a lot of the logistics for the Chicago cards. Okay. The local TV, all the hiring of security and ushers at the amphitheater. Wow. They booked these cards 12 months in advance, which in fact they had to coordinate. Gagne had to coordinate, okay, where do I want Chicago to fit? I had to make sure that Chicago fit into my AWA schedule at all those other cities, like Milwaukee. In fact, many times Gagne would have another show running in Milwaukee the same night.
Okay. So you had to figure out what talent might be available. So you'd have to clear everything with Verne. I get it. This makes total sense in regards to... So basically, Bob Luce paid his dues in order to become that crazy, wacky promoter we would know down the line.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was it grew to the point, and I'll discuss later, where it was Luce that had his own television, where he bought the TV time slot and sold ads for his own wrestling show, which promoted the Chicago Wrestling Club.
Oh, okay.
We'll get into that, but that was fun. One of his main roles.
Right.
And he had the foresight to film, I think it was over 100 hours of International Amphitheater footage.
And we're lucky that some of that's out there because there's some fun stuff.
Yes. Anyway, I want everybody to know that I have brought along many audio clips so you could hear a lot of the wrestlers who made this history. In fact, I have 13 audio clips to play for you guys, and I hope they'll give a flavor of what it was like. And I thought I could start off with one of the partners, Wilbur Snyder.
Okay.
And we have here a short interview of Wilbur Snyder talking about an upcoming wrestling card at the International Amphitheater. So this is 1966 Wilbur Snyder on WCIU Channel 26 in Chicago. I should let everyone know, too. It's interesting because we saw in Chicago taped matches from both Minneapolis and Indianapolis.
Okay.
I had no idea. At the time, I didn't know where these were originating from. They never said, "Oh, greetings from Indianapolis." No. But eventually I learned that. But yeah, we weren't any of the wiser. We just saw television wrestling, and that was good enough for us. So here's Wilbur Snyder in a TV interview from 1966.
Now, to get back to this card, the one match that has been signed, Henning and Race against the Dick the Bruiser and his cousin, the Crusher. And I've asked one of the finest wrestlers in the business today, that is Wilbur Snyder, to come in here and tell us a little bit about this, Wilbur.
Thank you very much, Bob. I just happened to be around in the studio at this particular time. I wasn't on this card and not on the next one. But I'm due to other commitments, and I would just like to explain a little bit about the reason that this match has been signed, Crusher and Bruiser against Henning and Race. I think everybody's seen the match, which would have been last night, knows how they actually literally had to carry the little midget out of that ring, and I think that it's kind of got to all the fans a little bit, and it was last night that they got a hold of the Crusher and Bob Luce, I'm talking of promoter matchmaker Bob Luce, and this match was made last night. Bruiser and Crusher consented to wrestling Henning and Race on this next card, which the date
will be November 2nd, Saturday.
Right. So that's the way this came about, and unfortunately, he hasn't had time to put any of the other matches together yet.
Wow. And listening to Wilbur Snyder there just for a moment, a lot of people, the polarizing figure that was Dick the Bruiser, the legendary figure that was Dick the Bruiser, Verne Gagne, everybody knows those names in the history of wrestling. Even my grandfather, who wasn't really a wrestling fan, grew up in the 50s, so he would tell me stories of Dick the Bruiser or a Mr. Moto or some of those guys that were on TV during that time period. Wilbur Snyder doesn't get passed around enough verbally, not a lot of discussion of him, but in the few matches that exist of him during his prime years or his better years, he was a hell of a worker too on top. He was no slouch.
Yes.
He wasn't just a guy that bought into the territory and a guy that got to work the shows. Wilbur Snyder deserved that spot on the card.
Yes. He had many top challenges to Luce for the NWA championships, during those years. And he was sort of like a mild-mannered Clark Kent among the owners. Of course, you had growly Dick the Bruiser, but Wilbur. But Wilbur, they were a perfect combination. I thought, Wilbur was in Indianapolis was actually the bookkeeper.
Well,
he's the one that counted the beans for.
Well, if somebody had to do it, I would certainly have put my money on him.
Yes,
It's like the Odd Couple, but it worked.
Bruiser was like the talent relations guy.
Well, I guess if he needed a job title.
But anyway, back to Chicago now.
Sure. I didn't mean to get you off your topic because
no, that's okay.
If you wanted to run down this debut card, the matches. Here.
Yes, Bruiser lost to NWA champion Gene Comiskey, who had won the belt from Fez the previous night in St. Louis.
Talk about lucking out into a world title match, huh?
Yeah. Yes. Of course, they didn't. That was about the last time they used an NWA champion for the Chicago Wrestling Club. But, they were established. That was probably a big deal to have the NWA champion in Chicago, where in the 1950s and into the early 60s, Chicago was part of the NWA. But, that was, in fact, the last NWA title defense in Chicago. On that same card, Wilbur went against Johnny Valentine and Gagne against Chris Markoff. And that's where those guys established the graduated payout system, where the wrestling talent roughly received 30% of the gross receipts. That was distributed to talent.
Okay.
And then it was allocated, with owners and main event players getting more than the preliminary wrestlers, and it was like a graduated scale on everyone else in between. In fact, we'll review later on, once the Chicago Wrestling Club gets rolling, we will talk about a detailed payoff schedule for one of their ballpark cards.
Wow, okay.
At White Sox Ballpark. But one thing, when you consolidated two organizations, the AWA and the WWA, which they did in 1966, you have two world champions. Each of those promotions had its own champion at the time. The AWA champ was Mad Dog Vachon. The WWA champ was Dick the Bruiser. So there was a decision made, well, boys, we only could have one champion. So they staged several matches, 3 matches, in early 1966 between Bruiser and the Mad Dog.
Okay.
It ended up with Mad Dog retaining his AWA championship and the Bruiser never defending that WWA title in Chicago ever again.
Wow, okay.
Yes.
That's news to me.
Yes. I mean, in Indianapolis, Bruiser was still the WWA World's Champion. Uh-huh. But from then on in Chicago, only the AWA belts were recognized on television and worn at the matches at the International Amphitheater. There were no longer WWA belts in Indianapolis.
Okay, that's very interesting.
And when Chicago would show the AWA matches from Minneapolis with the AWA champions being introduced with the belts, and with Gagne or Mad Dog, whoever was the AWA champion,
right?
What they would do in Indianapolis, their champions would wear their belts to the ring, prance around, pose to the crowd, take off the belts, give them to the timekeeper, and then tape would roll.
Wow, okay. That way there was no confusion on the Chicago TV. I got it. Okay. Makes sense.
That's how they did that. Well, in the starting of the Chicago Wrestling Club, in my estimation, and by the way, this is also the opinion of Minnesota AWA wrestling expert number 1, George Shire.
Oh, yeah.
That the number 1 tag team feud during these years was the team of Pretty Boy Larry Hennig and Handsome Harley Race versus Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher.
Wow.
Those guys had 7 main events in Chicago from 1966 to 1968, and both teams held those AWA titles multiple times.
It seems to me that usually on top we would get the singles match. I know some territories had the tag teams on top, and I see tag team main events throughout here, but it's not the commonplace. And so to say these guys main evented 7 times, these particular 2 teams, says a lot about both sides of the fence. I mean, looking at the names, anybody can go, well, yeah, duh. But at the same time, I just, my God, look at the Harley Race and Larry Hennig, one of the greatest heel teams of all time. And of course, Crusher and Bruiser, one of the greatest teams, period, of all times. Wow, it's amazing to think that this is going down in Chicago.
Yes, and every match was a rough and tumble brawl. Hennig and Race were called the Dolly Sisters by the beer-drinking Bruiser and Crusher.
Of course.
But yeah, of course. But, they were the more technically trained wrestlers in real life. Mm-hmm. But I just had to bring up that feud. That was such a big thing in Chicago. And sometimes also on those same cards, there was an AWA championship bout. By then, Verne Gagne had taken the belt from Mad Dog Vachon. And what I consider the number 1 singles feud in Chicago in the 1960s involved Verne Gagne and Dr. X, also known as Dick Beyer and the Destroyer.
Right.
in other parts of the country. You know, in October 1967, by the way, the Destroyer had been wrestling in Chicago as the Destroyer.
Okay.
And after that October 67 card at the original Playboy Club nightclub in Chicago, Gagne met up with Dick Beyer, and he said, "You know what? I'd like you to have a new identity in here as Dr. X."
So let me ask you, in that regard, since this was not an angle on TV, this was Verne coming to Beyer and saying, "Let's change it up. Let's give you something different." Was this portrayed on TV as a completely different human, or was this?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
In fact, it was very clever staging.
Okay.
All of a sudden, on the AWA television, fans became aware that there was a masked wrestler sitting in the ringside seats with his arms crossed watching the match. And, of course, they put the camera on him, and the announcer says, "Hey, I wonder who that guy is."
Right.
And he eventually interfered with a match against Verne. I think he put the figure 4 leg lock on him. And all of a sudden, Dr. X was in the main events all across the AWA circuit, including Chicago. He defeated the Crusher in an individual match and Bruiser in an individual match before having main events against Gagne across the circuit.
Well, that's one way to get somebody over.
Yes. So we have here, we have a short interview with Verne Gagne talking about this feud he had with Dr. X, he frequently added, "I don't think this guy deserves it as a wrestler, but he interfered with my match, perfect drama to have a feud for multiple matches that went into 1968. So let's listen to Verne Gagne back in the day talking about his feud with Dr. X.
You saw Verne in action on the screen. Verne, that was a pretty good match.
Thank you, Marty.
Verne, this guy Dr. X has been storming from coast to coast, border to border. Now you're finally going to take him on in Chicago.
Well, it's been a long, long time coming, Marty, and I don't really feel that he deserves the match. I certainly didn't want to give him the match because of the tactics that he's used in the past, what he did to me when my back was turned. I know he was trying to provoke me into a match, but with so much pressure from the local promoter. And my own pride, probably stepping in front of my better sense and better judgment, I did accept the match. And not because I am afraid to wrestle this man, but I don't feel that he really deserves the match because of his tactics and because of how the type of person he is, the things he does and things that he says.
But Verne, nevertheless, there's a certain amount of personal pride that you have, and this guy is one guy I think you want to really meet head to head. Just, no doubt about it. There's one man that I want to just beat very, very badly, and not just beat him. But as you know, I was out of wrestling for 3 weeks because of his great scientific tactics by jumping on a man when his back is turned. But maybe we can reciprocate just a little bit. As you know, handsome pretty boy Larry is just out of the cast, and maybe with that cast being vacant, we can put somebody else's legs in there. Verne, I haven't heard you talk, that is personally about anyone like this fellow.
Really, it's not really the way to talk either. I think I just better let myself seethe inside. And I know we have a lot of children watching, that sort of thing. And let's say that I will meet him in the ring, and we'll see who the best man is.
Well, fans, I can say this. I've talked with Verne Gagne on many occasions in front of many television cameras, watched him in action many times, but I don't believe, and I mean this sincerely, that he feels quite this way or has felt quite this way before in his career. He's got more than a title to defend in his match against Dr. X.
Wow, Richard, these flashback audio, these soundbite clips that you provided to us for this program, I can't thank you enough to take us back in time and just help us relive, bring us back to that era and just kind of get the feel again. It's all again. They always talked about talking people into the arenas, but that really was the job back then, and everything just felt so real coming out of everybody's mouths back then before the scripts came out and things of that nature down the line. Now, guys would probably get bullet points, but since Verne was a promoter, he kind of knew exactly what to say there.
These clippings were provided to me through the courtesy of the late retired Chicago police officer Alan Fujara, who left us just early, I think last month.
Oh, wow.
You know,
Sorry
he
to
said,
hear
"Hey,
that.
if you want, I am too." And he said, "You know, maybe you want to use these to promote the book." So several times he had 6 hours
Wow.
of little 2-minute sound bites that he recorded himself on a little cassette recorder.
That's amazing.
So
long before the VCR, there were VCRs when I was a kid, and even I used an audio cassette recorder before we had a VCR in my house to record the localized promos and things when they were coming to our town back in the mid 1980s. And so, but we're going back much further than the 1980s here. And I just a treasure. Can't thank him enough. I'm very sorry to hear he just passed away. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
thank goodness, that he preserved all of these sound clips, man. Just an amazing time in history.
And now we'll listen to Dr. X during the same time period, talking about his upcoming matches with Verne. In fact, one thing that he would always say, this is Dr. X on TV, distinctive voice, he would say, "I'm the only winner Chicago ever had." Because at the time, all of the major sports teams in the mid to late 1960s weren't always championships. We had 1961 Stanley Cup with the Hawks, 63, but in a lot of those years, the Bears, we didn't even have the Bulls until 1966. So let's hear Dr. X preaching to the Chicago wrestling audience.
Man, Dr. X.
Just 1 minute, please. The people in my hometown saw me annihilate the Bruiser and the Crusher, who are teaming up to go against this here Japanese champion. The people aren't going to go out and see these people. The people in Chicago have got a winner. They're going out to see Dr. X annihilate somebody who did something to their hero. They got somebody to cheer for. Never before in Chicago did they have anybody to cheer for. Now they got somebody to cheer for. Dr. X. A couple of weeks ago, they saw this here Watts jump in a ring and cut my mask off. I wrestled a man on TV. I put the hold on one man. I was a little tired, and this man here come in and tried my nerves just a little bit too far. I went to put the hold on Watts, and he refused to lay still so I could put the hold on properly. Now, you know, and these people know, I said two things. I'll put the hold on any wrestler if they can break it once it's properly applied, and they can break it, I'll give them $5,000. And the other thing is, any wrestler that beats me 2 pinfalls or submission falls on a 3, I'll take the mask off. So then Watts jumps up and jumps right from behind as I'm leaving the ring and cuts my mask off and tries to reveal my identity some way that every other wrestler, you and all the promoters alike would like to know who I am.
Right.
Well, listen here. Let him do it in the ring like a man. Beat me 2 pinfalls out of 3. So the people in Chicago, all the way from Evanston, all the way down into Hammond and across the Cicero, the talk about Chicago is how Dr. X got robbed on the title match with Gagne. That's the one. The one that why I'm not wearing a belt. Well, I got news for you. As far as my fans are concerned, I am the champion. I'm an uncrowned world champion. I won. I don't have any belt to show for it, but I haven't lost faith, or as far as myself, I want one thing, and that's the championship. And Verne Gagne and Watts, you're just a stepping stone.
Wow, Dick Beyer knew how to get heat, and over on my Pro Wrestling Academy show, we've been covering Japan deeply, and what an amazing character. He had his own TV show in Japan, an American with a TV show in Japan, variety show, Dick Beyer, and just watching him wrestle all the matches that we've been going through in the 1970s and how amazing he was, the bumps he was taking and the way he fluidly moved in and out of all the different wrestling holds in the 70s, mind you. So I can only imagine how smooth, how good these matches were with Beyer here back in the 1960s.
I didn't know. I never put 2 and 2 together. It wasn't until the videotape trading era in the 1980s where I get this videotape from Japan, Dick Beyer talking to the crowd in Tokyo, It was an event honoring Ricky Dozen.
Uh-huh.
And I hear him talk. He says, "Oh my God, that's Dr. X." But it didn't. But the wrestling magazines at the time in the 70s, they never said, "Wink, wink, folks. Dick Beyer is the Destroyer and Dr. X."
Right.
Now, there are very knowledgeable wrestling fans that were personal friends of these guys. Insiders knew who it was, but I didn't, sitting on the outside. But he made a quite contribution. He played with Syracuse University on their football team in the Orange Bowl, college football, in the early 1950s. So he was accomplished in football too. Hey, I wanted to give special attention here to a team that simultaneously, for many long months, held both the AWA and the WWA tag team titles from late 1967 to late 1968. And that was the team of Mitsu Arakawa and Dr. Moto. This must have been a scheduling and logistical nightmare to schedule those guys as the champs in the main event for both promotions. But they were so effective in scaring the public. Of course, in 1960, that was still 25 years after Pearl Harbor. Right. There was still a Japanese hatred in the 1960s because of this.
Well, wrestling didn't help qualm that very much, did they?
Eventually, it dissipated,
Right, yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, I have an audio clip from this era because the major competitor for Arakawa and Moto were none other than Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher. So here's a clip of the Crusher talking about his in-the-ring experiences with Arakawa and Moto.
We're going to talk with a fabulous judge all about it right now and find out how he feels about being once again the World Tag Team Champions. Crusher, I want to congratulate you. You and Dick did a tremendous job.
That's right, Marty. We did what we said we were going to do. We sent them two coolies back to Japan. We took over the geisha houses. So now me and the Bruiser are the emperors of Japan. But the main thing, not only being the emperors, we're the World Tag Team Champions, and we're going to retire the World Tag Team Champions and open up the biggest saloon they ever had on Madison Street in Chicago.
Crusher, you're picking on a mighty, mighty tough opponent in the Chain Gang on the 21st.
Well, Marty, we want to go out as fighting champions, right? When we retire, Marty, we want everybody to say the Crusher gave everybody a chance, the Bruiser gave everybody a chance. So we got these two hippies, creepies, whatever you want to call them. They never take a bath. They never comb their hair. They ride their bicycles, motorcycles, whatever you had. They got chains all around them. But the main thing is, we're not only going to defend our title, Marty, but I got this vacuum cleaner, and I'm going to give them a good cleaning right after we beat them, Marty. We're going to get the lice out of their hair. We're going to get the rest of the bugs out of their body. And if they've ever been clean in their life, they're going to be clean when me and the Bruiser get done with them in Chicago.
That Crusher, it's always cool to hear him back in the day, in any era, really, to hear the Crusher cut a promo. Nobody could do it quite like the Crusher. And Arakawa and Moto, you mentioned they were both AWA and WWA Tag Team Champion. And we talked about the logistics a little earlier of trying to get the guys booked into Chicago on dates that they weren't working the same day, perhaps for Verne in another city as well. So not only are they champions in two separate promotions, but they're technically wrestling in a third promotion, so to speak here. So they're very much wanted in that Midwest region right now, are Arakawa and Moto.
The three owners had to sit down in the fall of each year and say, okay, what are we going to do next year? When are we going to book the amphitheater shows? And Bruiser's thinking, okay, when am I going to book Indianapolis? And then Gagne, is figuring out, okay, when am I going to do Milwaukee and Minneapolis? Of course, Minneapolis I have to do on a Saturday night because I have the TV tapings at the Calhoun Beach Hotel on a Saturday afternoon. Anyway, so it must have been, they had to figure this out a year in advance so that there's the possibility of using those tag team champions. There were many instances in AW history where their main wrestlers would wrestle on TV in Minneapolis on a Saturday afternoon, hop on a flight, and wrestle in Chicago that same night, or wrestle in Milwaukee that same night, on the days when they didn't have a live show in Minneapolis or St. Paul.
Right, I gotcha.
But here's a major thing about the first decade of Chicago Wrestling Club, and this continued throughout the 1970s, and that is a recurring theme, a feud between Dick the Bruiser and the Bobby Heenan family.
Oh, yeah.
Heenan got his start. Well, his first matches were in Indianapolis, but 6 months later he was in Chicago managing in semi-main events. He managed a team called the Assassins. Now, this was not the Georgia Wrestling Jody Hamilton,
right.
Tom Ernesto. These were Bruiser Assassins, and these were wrestling veterans Joe Tommaso and John Hill. Okay. Of course, John Hill, he was Jerry Valiant in his day and the Masked Strangler.
Guy Mitchell.
A lot of different. Yeah, Guy Mitchell.
Here in Cleveland, he was the Stomper, right? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. But anyway, we have a clip here of Bruiser bad-mouthing Bobby Heenan. Oh. That's pretty typical of how Bruiser, would... Oh, here's one thing on Bruiser in Chicago.
Okay.
He was almost always scheduled to be the last interview of the show. So the announcer sets him up, and he says, "I'm sorry, Bruiser, we're out of time here." And the announcer would say, "Be sure to go to the amphitheater Friday, December." And Bruiser would start ranting and raving until as the TV time wore out.
Gotcha.
Here's Bruiser ranting and raving on Chicago TV.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, here comes Dick the Bruiser. Dick the Bruiser. We've been hoping to talk with you. I conveyed Heenan's request to Bob Luce and still haven't had an answer.
Bobby Heenan, the world's most beautiful female impersonator, has outdone himself. He figured that Dick the Bruiser would not, he thinks that Dick the Bruiser is not too smart upstairs. He figured that Dick the Bruiser would run from a match from a man from Texas that would have chains in the match. Well, Dick the Bruiser has been in several matches with chains. In fact, I can't go into it, but I know chains. Now, I'm going to tell you what. I talked to Bob Luce just a few minutes ago, and I told promoter Bob Luce, I will take this match if Heenan will wrestle Red Cloud with the chain. Now, let me just go over this a second. Bobby Heenan is going to be chained by his wrist to Billy Red Cloud. And in order for this to happen, Dick the Bruiser will be chained to the ankle like this. And the other end of the chain will be chained to Blackjack Mulligan. In other words, Blackjack Mulligan cannot escape me, and Bobby Heenan will not get away from Red Cloud. I have done this, I have signed this match purposely to get rid of Heenan once and for all. Red Cloud will break him in half, will cut him to ribbons. This is a very serious thing.
Ah, good times, the old days. And he couldn't fire himself, Dick the Bruiser, just a man.
And that was pretty and that was pretty strong, referring to Heenan as a pipsqueak female impersonator.
Mm-hmm.
Using that angle, which, I don't know, that angle hasn't been used in recent decades.
No, not really. You can't really do that anymore so much. But Bobby Heenan. So let's sit a spell here for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about Bobby Heenan, or else our listeners are going to get very upset with both of us. And so I want to get your personal memories of, maybe not the first time you remember seeing Bobby Heenan on your TV screen, but just in general, your first thoughts on Bobby Heenan. Was he just the average manager out there? Or did you see something from the beginning like, this guy gets more heat, or this guy, there's something about him that's a little more? Because as we know, Bobby Heenan would go on to become, in my personal opinion, the greatest manager of all time. Now, I know that's debatable. I'm just curious, when you first saw Bobby Heenan, some of the first stuff he was doing in front of you in the arena or on TV, your initial thoughts of him as a manager.
The first two impressions were, when his man was in the ring for a television taping in Indianapolis, he'd sit next to announcer Chuck Marlowe. He was one of the first bad guy protagonist color commentators.
Oh, okay. Wow.
You know what I'm saying? That would only happen for matches when his guy was in the ring. He'd say, look at that, Marlowe. He didn't pull his hair. The opponent lost his balance.
So he had decades of experience doing this.
Yes. Okay. And he was a great in-the-ring interviewer during this time, which we have some Heenan clips on this program today. Okay. I remember the May 21st, 1966 card. The main event was Bruiser against Mad Dog Vachon in a Congo death match, which is similar to a Texas death match. Okay. But earlier in the card, it was the Assassins with Heenan against Wilbur Snyder and Moose Chowak. Mm-hmm. And the way that Heenan would rile up the crowd just in the ring, shaking his fist to the crowd, the way he would react to the ring introduction. I remember for many years in Indianapolis, he would do this routine. They would get ready. He'd be in the ring with his men. They're getting ready to introduce the wrestlers. The bell would ring. And Heenan then all of a sudden would be talking into the ear of the ring announcer. Okay. And the ring announcer would nod his head. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, Bobby Heenan demands silence when his men are introduced. And we know how much that worked.
Right. There wasn't too many templates for managers back then to copy off of, right? You know, Bobby Davis, obviously up in the New York area or Washington, D.C., but it's crazy to think how just a natural Bobby Heenan, you're telling me he's doing everything that I saw him do in the 1980s.
Yes, he was already doing that.
Okay.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Rasslin podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Pro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron. over at patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Rasslin, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, Videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia podcast network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
Hey, Bruiser buddies, I want you to listen to Wrestling Nostalgia with Dave Dynasty. Every week, he has the roughest and toughest interviews in the podcast world today, with the best guests you could ask for. There's no bums on this show. Let Dave Dynasty be your podcasting tag team partner and listen to Wrestling Nostalgia while drinking beer, smoking cigars, and busting heads. Just look it up on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe today, because the Bruiser said so.
Anyway, starting in the 1970s, by the way, by this time, Heenan's full-time work is in the AWA as Gorgeous Bobby Heenan, and he's managing Blackjack Lanza, just to keep it in perspective. Okay. But in 1971, Bob Luce started his own television program on Channel 44, WSNS-TV, and Channel 44, where he would show these filmed matches from the amphitheater. He would sponsor a pre-match dinner party at the Stockyard Inn Steakhouse, which was right next to the International Amphitheater. He would have his lucky number programs where all the programs had a stamp number on them. Mm-hmm. So they would have a drawing, 3 numbers, and you win tickets to the next matches. He had dedicated sponsors. He had an used car dealer called Ben's Auto Sales. He had One Stop Convenience Store as a sponsor, and Bobo Brazil did the ads. Where he would say, when I go to Chicago, I stop at One Stop where I buy beer by the case, and I buy spare ribs in the 50-pound boxes. That's where I buy. Go get them, Bobo.
Whatever works, man, right? It's a celebrity,
yeah,
Bobo Brazil out there doing that.
And the 1970 started with, on August 14th, 1970, with a big card at White Sox Comiskey Park. And that was the same site as Buddy Rogers versus Pat O'Connor in 1961. So on this card, we had AWA champion Verne Gagne against his former referee, who had really progressed in the previous 3 or 4 years, Baron von Raschke. He wrestled collegiately at Nebraska, started out setting up the ring, refereeing, and I remember in my interview with Raschke, he said, something? I had no idea that they were planning that until it came for the promotional interview, where Bruiser said to me, okay, you're up next. August 14th, you're wrestling Gagne at Comiskey Park. What do you mean? He says, yeah, we're telling you now. You're in the main event against Gagne.
AWA World Title.
Yeah. Also on that card was a big feud of that time. It was the AWA Tag Team Champions, Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon, against the Bruiser and the Crusher. The Dogs had won the titles in 1969, and the build-up was tremendous. In fact, here's a soundbite from 1970 where Mad Dog is sort of having trepidations about being in a cage with Bruiser and the Crusher. So let's hear Mad Dog Vachon.
They want no part of this whatsoever.
They want no part of it whatsoever. Do you realize that they are trying to kill us in the city of Chicago for what I did to the Crusher a couple of years ago? Well, I was not responsible. This was an accident. I play for everything. Listen, Mr. O'Neill. Yes, it's true. We signed to wrestle with the Crusher and the Bruiser in Comiskey Park. But what is this I hear about wrestling with them inside a cage ring like? What's the matter? Put both hands up. Pull up your hands.
Yeah, that's it.
Listen, you must be kidding me.
Those are the terms.
Look, my brother and I can see that Chicago is trying to get our right. Why are you trying to kill us? I appeal to somebody in Chicago that has any authority to come back to you. This is treating us like dogs, like animals. I want somebody that still has his mind left to stop this kind of a butchery. We are wrestlers by nature. We are wrestlers by profession. But we're not fattest like the Crusher and the Bruiser. They never forget the day that we took the title away from them in a clean, respectable match. Now, they want us to wrestle in a cage like animals. But it's up to nothing. Let me tell you something. You want us in a cage? It's gonna cost you, Mr. Luce, and the city of Chicago, $20,000 for me and $20,000 for my brother.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have never heard. Ladies and gentlemen, I have never heard such demands before in my life, but Mad Dog Vachon just made it $20,000 apiece for he and his brother to go through that fence match with the Crusher and Bruiser in Comiskey Park on August 14th.
Oh, I love it, man. Mad Dog Vachon. Nobody had quite the voice of the Mad Dog, and he sounded like a Mad Dog, and you believed it. He wasn't the tallest guy in the world of wrestling, but man, he was scary as anybody on the list you could think of. And wow, that's a fun one.
Mm-hmm. And that promotion continued to prosper. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier.
Sure.
But the Chicago Wrestling Club from 1966 to 1983 did 255 wrestling cards in those years. And 247, most of them were at the International Amphitheater. But every few years they would do a bigger venue, hoping to draw, bigger crowds and make more money. The next big card at note was September 1st, 1972. This was at Soldier Field. On top was Verne Gagne against the Russian Bear Ivan Koloff, who defeated Bruno for the WWF title in 1971, which was a stunning upset.
But I wanted to point out here, before you get into the feud with Verne Gagne, I see that Koloff's managed by the Big K. Is that Stan Kowalski?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the same guy. So that was a big main event on Soldier Field. Next, the tag team that night, in my opinion, was the number one tag feud in the Chicago Wrestling Club in the 1970s. That was a cage match with Bruiser and Crusher versus Blackjack's Lanza Mulligan with Bobby Heenan. It was filmed by Bob Luce, and it resulted in one of the biggest bloodbaths in Chicago Wrestling Club history. The referee was former boxing champion Jersey Joe Walcott.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's talk right now. Here's another 1972 interview with Bobby Heenan, and he talks about his longtime nemesis, Dick the Bruiser. And here he also talks about Dr. X, who by this time has turned face. He's a good guy now, Dr. X. But let's listen to, let's listen to Heenan in 1972.
Blackjack Lanza and Gorgeous Bobby Heenan are here instead of Koloff because they said they've got something to say. Blackjack and Gorgeous Bobby.
X gets on here and he tells you he's got a size 11 fist. Happen to know he only wears a size 6.5 B shoe. So how can he have a size 11 fist? He has a size 11 opening in his mask for his big mouth. Now you take his other partner. One man hides his face, and the other man can't think of a way to hide his face. So you got Bruiser and Dr. X. Dr. X, Mr. Bruiser, how many times do you have to get your face slapped, humiliated in Chicago, and beat to a pulp before you realize to step out of the way, and then there'll be Bastine and the Crusher. But that's coming. We'll just have to take them as they come, right? So tonight in Chicago, I'll be sitting there, and I'm not going to be worried about you sneaking around the post. You'll be watching for me to come around the post, jerk you off the apron, might take your mask off you, and show everybody your ugly face, and your red hair, and your big black eyes you still got from the last time you got beaten, and your flat nose, and your busted lip, and your 3 teeth hanging down. You're not going to hurt my beautiful face, or dare touch my gorgeous blonde hair, Dr. X, you half-wit. You and that other imbecile for a partner. I'm through talking.
Well, I would say the more things change, the more they stay the same. Bobby Heenan, always an excellent promo.
Okay. The next event I think it's worth talking about in the Chicago Wrestling Club was the arrival in late 1972. Dusty Rhodes then became an AWA wrestler, and then he brought in Dick Murdoch as a tag team partner. And they had some wild matches against the Bruiser and the Crusher in March 1973, which are on YouTube, which were filmed by Bob Luce and made it onto YouTube. So let's listen to a clip of Dusty Rhodes from 1972. Now, he's talking about Snyder and Gagne, but we just wanted you to see as early as 1972. This is a lot of the same personality as we came to expect from Dusty Rhodes.
Here we go.
Now, what Dirty Dusty Rhodes has in mind, I don't know, but here he is.
You know, the only thing I got in mind, Marty O'Neill, is to take that championship from Verne Gagne and to meet the Bruiser and the Crusher and Bo Belinsky or whoever else want to meet me, baby, in that square circle right there in Chicago, because that's where it's at, baby. That's where all that green bread is, right there in Chicago. And I'm going to tell you one thing about Chicago and me. You know, Chicago, I have yet to lose a match in Chicago. And I've been in Chicago twice, and I wrestled the tennis champion of the world, Wilbur Snyder, and beat his brains out. And I got it all together now. I'll tell you what, I'm going to be coming into Chicago with one thing in mind. That's run that Bo Belinsky out of town, baby. And I'm going to get in the middle of that ring, and I'm going to challenge everybody in sight. Just see how much guts they got in Chicago. Big Dust is going to get it on now in Chicago, Marty. You know what I'm talking about. Can you dig that?
Got it all the way, Dusty, all the way. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll get it tonight, because Dusty Rhodes meets Bo Belinsky.
Well, he wasn't quite the Meccan Dream yet, Bebith, but you can definitely hear it. That charisma, it was always there from the get-go with Dusty Rhodes, Richard.
And later on, I want to give credit to his new tag team partner, which became superstar Billy Graham. What a matchup that was.
Tell me about it.
And wait till you hear this next interview. This is from 1975. Now, we're going a little out of sequence, but we want to keep it with Dusty. Him and Graham promoting their tag bouts in Chicago. They were doing some special promotional attention to African-American wrestling fans. So let's go back to Dusty and the Superstar.
We are not pretending, we're not plastic. When I shuffle and when the man boogaloos in Chicago, it's going to be like watching the great Judy Garland and Barbara Streisand in the same place. Mae West, Sophie Tucker in the same place. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier in the same building. Superstar Billy Graham and Sweet Soul Dusty Rhodes in the same arena. If you can't get off on that, you don't belong in our movement, you understand? You don't belong there, I'm sure. You'll be there.
We have agreed, Dusty Rhodes and I have agreed, we are making a change to the amphitheater because of so many soul brothers and soul sisters have supported us. We are taking out the popcorn machine and we're installing a barbecue pit.
That's right.
The barbecue, but it's all
Gentlemen, there they go, Big Dust and superstar Billy Graham.
Charisma overload. I didn't know you could have both of these guys on the same TV screen at the same time, and cutting a promo at the same time. But apparently it happened.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, when Superstar says, we're going to put a barbecue pit in the International Amphitheater. Anyway, let's move ahead now to 1974.
Before we jump ahead, I was just looking at the Soldier Field card in 1972, September 1st, and not all the listeners are going to be on my social media. I'll post, the big matches like this and things on there for them to kind of look at the cards from time to time. But I'm just looking at this card from head to toe, and 1972, some of these guys haven't quite hit their peak yet, but just looking up and down the card, you see Don Morocco, some of the legends of the time, obviously Bobo Johnson over Little Bruiser midget match on the card, Baron von Raschke on the card, Andre Rusimov in a handicap match, a.k.a. Andre the Giant over Larry Hennig, and Butcher Vachon, Dusty Rhodes defeating Wahoo McDaniel. This is 1972, guys. Nick Bockwinkel and Stevens over Billy Robinson, Wilbur Snyder, Crusher and Bruiser over Lanza and Mulligan. Just like we were talking about that tag match, just amazing. The card they did here, 12,000 people out there to Soldier Field. I was just marveling at the entire lineup while you were discussing it here.
That was okay. That was good. I want to give some insight into that card.
Yeah,
they really jacked up, doubled and tripled prices of matches for that, and it was the prices were so outrageous. I didn't even have the nerve to say to my parents, "Can you take me to this wrestling card?" I mean, because it was maybe the top ticket at the amphitheater was $5. See, this card happened around the same time as the Summer Olympic Games in Munich. So Bob Luce had the seat sections. We have gold section of seats, and we have the silver section and the bronze section. I don't have any documentation. I just remembered there's no way. I thought I'd tried a sympathy routine with grandparents. Oh, Grandma, can you give me money so I can go to wrestling? Of course, let's see. I am a sophomore in high. I don't have a driver's license yet. Yeah, I knew right ahead. Don't even ask. And like you said, they had 12,000, which was the same as an amphitheater, although they had presumably a pretty good box office on that. Although there's no documentation survives for the Soldier Field card.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, the next major card was September 7th, 1974 at Comiskey Ballpark, and the main feud in the 70s, in my opinion, was Verne Gagne against the scientific Billy Robinson. I was at the amphitheater on July 20th, where Gagne won the title. Of course, the decision was later reversed, and I must say the roof almost blew off the amphitheater with this. Gagne and Robinson also had a feud in the feature film, The Wrestler.
Right.
Which I don't know. That was national distribution, but I hear it did better in the AWA towns because it was all AWA people in it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The second main event on September 7th, 1974, Dick the Bruiser and Bobo against Bobby Heenan and the Sheik. Of course, this continued a long-standing nemesis of good guy Bruiser versus bad guy Heenan.
That's an interesting tag team. I'm sorry. The Sheik and Bobby
Heenan, of course, could do more than manage.
Right.
He was above average wrestler.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he can
and
sell.
Of course, that bout
like nobody's business.
Yeah, and this bout was just used to set up a future rivalry between Bruiser and the Sheik, because not once in the match did Bruiser ever lay his hand on the Sheik. When the Bruiser would tag into the ring, Sheik would start running in the circles, jump through the ropes to avoid. The big card was just used to set up the cards down the line.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's crazy to have a ballpark show, and it's really just to build up for your future events. It's kind of crazy to think about. And I can see that based on Bobby being involved in the matchup here. But you think about that, too, with Dick the Bruiser and the Sheik and their issues when Bruiser tried to run the Detroit territory, and they basically hot-shotted against one another and all that up there. And, at the end of the day.
that rivalry ended in that same year.
Right.
The Bruiser had started the invasion in 1971.
And now the guys are working together.
Yeah, that's wrestling for you. Mm-hmm. But anyway, here's an audio clip. This is from 1974 with Verne Gagne talking about Billy Robinson and the challenges that he faces going up against an extreme shooter scientific wrestler in Billy Robinson.
Say, Billy Robinson is the greatest wrestler to come down the pike in many years. Well, I'll add my amens to that also, because he, without a doubt, he is. This is a lot of firsts here on this match. I've never wrestled Billy Robinson before. This is his first chance at the title in this country. He's been in the country now some 8 months from England, and many other firsts, too numerous to mention as far as Billy Robinson goes. I know it'll be the first time I see a lot of the holds that he's going to throw at me. I've watched him. I've admired the way, or his technique. He has a much different technique than most American wrestlers. I think his basic background training was different than ours, and he'd be throwing things at me that I've never seen before. I don't think he's reached all the way into his bag of tricks yet. I think he's been waiting for this match. He's going to be ready for it. If he can win it, of course, it means a big thing to him. I'm not conceding. Never conceded anything in your life, have you? No, and this is going to be my biggest one here in 1972 so far. The year is very, very new. And I certainly hope it's not going to be my first defense of the title and last defense of the title in 1972. I am looking forward to a very tough match, probably the toughest clean match, and I say clean match. This may disappoint some people, but it will be a clean match, I'm quite sure. But it's going to be one of the toughest, if not the toughest, in my career. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you one thing. Verne Gagne, as you know, has been a great champion.
Verne was the world champion, and, you could stick him in there against larger-than-life characters and go, eek, could be a little bit of trouble. Some of the brawlers, the wild men, and things of that nature. But Billy Robinson posed a different threat, really. I mean, he was, like you said, a shooter. Now, we didn't know what a shooter was growing up, but no. I mean, you could tell in the ring the guy knew what he was doing as a wrestler, an actual professional wrestler, or a wrestler in general. The Wigan training of Billy Robinson really shined no matter where he went, and his matches with Verne were legendary.
That was a significant card in Chicago at White Sox Park, September 7th, 1974. I thought I'd review the payoffs for talent the entire night.
Well, yeah, you want me to run over the card as far as the results go, and then you can talk about what they made?
Well, here's what you tell me. You describe the matches.
Okay.
And I will tell you what the payoffs were after each match.
Oh, sounds good. Okay, so we do have a ladies' match.
And by the way, for the record, the gross box office receipts were 108,000.
Wow, okay.
And the payoffs totaled 28% of the gross.
So close to 30. Okay.
Yes.
So I don't know if this is in the exact order of which the matches took place, but we'll start from the bottom and work our way up as far as the results go. Ladies match, Vivian Vachon over Lucille Dupree.
Vivian got $430 and Lucille $300.
Wow, and you got to figure that would be, Vivian.
That's pretty good money.
Yeah, that's
let's say an average factory worker made $250 a week, which would have been $100. Yeah, $100 a week. On the assembly line, at the widget factory.
Sure, that's got to be inflation calculator in my brain says over 2,000 a day. I mean, that's pretty amazing, especially, it's good to see the ladies weren't ripped off. Also on the card, Greg Gagne drew Buddy Wolf. Curious to see what Greg got.
$400 for Greg, $400 with Buddy. And Buddy was the husband of Vivian Vachon.
Right, yeah. I caught that. No, so I was going to say maybe Vivian got that extra little bit, because I saw Buddy was on the card. But Greg, I was shocked he didn't get an extra change there with Daddy involved. But that's really cool to see that the ladies were getting paid pretty close to what the guys were getting paid there in the undercard.
On the roughly 10 or 11 cards, I do not see any favoritism with payoffs to Greg or to Spike Huber, who is Bruiser's son-in-law, or Steve Regal, Wilbur's son-in-law.
Yeah. Kind of interesting, but that's because the promoters wanted to keep maybe a couple extra bucks. I don't know, but so Kim Duck, the future Tiger Chung Lee over Jumping Jim Brunzell.
They each got $350.
Okay, all right.
So that's pretty. That was probably the best card, their best individual payoff of the year. I don't know how many times they were on a card with a box office of $108,000.
I'm not positive what year Kim Duck broke in, but I know Jim Brunzell was coming out of Verne's camp just maybe a year or two prior. So he hadn't been in the business too long. So I'm sure he was happy with that payoff. Well, Wilbur Snyder, I don't know what he received as one of the promoters, but he's in a match here over Rene Goulet.
Well, those three promoter partners were the highest paid guys on the card. Yeah. Wilbur got $3,500. Rene Goulet got $600.
Okay.
I remember during the interview with Baron von Raschke says, well, we always knew that the owners got the first count of the money.
Right. Yeah.
So,
we've talked about that. I just recently talked about that with Bob Roop on his program. I talked about that with a few wrestlers lately about the owners. And I saw Ole and Ole's book. He talked about the promoters, the owners getting that first grab of the money. So you never really know, but it's kind of interesting to see Wilbur so far down on the card here.
Yeah, he didn't have a big ego. If they needed him at the time, Goulet was working his way up.
Yeah,
just getting the Sergeant Jacques Goulet moniker. So that was no problem with Wilbur. Will do that frequently if he has to put somebody over for the promotion, benefit of the promotion. You have to have those top villains have to have victories and have to have good showings, else it's going to be no big deal to beat them later when Bruiser or whatever.
Yeah, I get you. Well, we got Pepper Gomez, Pepper out here going to a no contest with Baron von Raschke.
$600 each guy.
Okay, that's fair. That's definitely fair. Baron hadn't been too far. Well, he walked right into a feud with Verne, so I guess he earned his keep. Chris Taylor, big Chris Taylor coming out of the Verne camp as well, the former Olympian, taking on Ox Baker and getting a win by disqualification over the Ox.
Yes, and this is a good example of a mixed match where Chris was working for the AWA at the time and Ox was working for the WWA. Taylor got $400, Ox got $500.
Wow, okay. I guess based on longevity, seniority, I guess Ox got a few extra bucks out of that, but
Taylor was still relatively new.
Yeah, so I was actually surprised, but what a battle! Think of those two big hosses in the ring against each other. That'd be a fun sight to see there in Chicago. 6-man tag team action: the Crusher, Ivan Putski, and Larry Hennig defeating Nick Bockwinkel, Ray Stevens, and superstar Billy Graham. What an amazing trio that! Bockwinkel, Stevens, and Graham. But on the other side, I mean, no slouches. Larry Hennig on the babyface side. We've got early Ivan Putski and a Crusher.
Yes. And, of course, this is the match where Graham turned babyface. Stevens and Bockwinkel would not let Superstar, they wouldn't let him tag into the match.
Oh, okay.
And then all of a sudden there's some shoving. I think it was Bockwinkel and Stevens that just deserted their partner on this.
Oh, all right.
And there was, I remember there were a lot of fighting out on the field, on the infield. I remember Superstar getting a body slam at home plate or along the baseline.
Nice.
They went out on the turf for this.
I love it.
Each one of these guys got $1,100
all
for
six
this
of them?
match. Yeah, each $1,100 per man.
Wow. Okay.
We're getting very close to the two top matches on this.
Yes. Tag team action, we talked about this already. The Sheik and Bobby Heenan defeating Dick the Bruiser and Bobo Brazil. I'd love to know the finish to that one. Who did the job? Who went over? How that transpired? But more importantly, what was the payoff here? Because we got guys all over. We got the promoter, we got the Sheik, but we got Bobby Heenan, a manager. I'm just curious.
By the way, Bobo was pinned after getting hit by fire.
Okay, fireball. That'll do it every time.
And of course, and like I mentioned earlier, this whole match was the Bruiser chasing the Sheik around the ring and not getting his hands on him.
Okay.
The payoffs were $2,000 for the Sheik, $1,500 for Heenan, which I think he deserved more because who puts butts in the seat?
Right.
But then again, too, Heenan is being paid more than any other villain on the card other than the Sheik himself. So I'm just saying, of course, Bruiser, $3,500 as the owner or some other main event. Bobo, they convinced him to come in for $1,000. So
wow,
Bobo probably wasn't as big a draw by then, but he was willing to come in for $1,000.
Well, it's not like he had never been in the ring with the Sheik before.
No, yeah, that's probably why he was booked in that. Because if you're gonna have both of them feel comfort with each other. Sheik knows I know that Bobo will work with me when I throw the fire, and he'll stand still, and Bobo feels comfort. I know the Sheik will do this, and he won't hurt me. That's my position,
And most importantly, he agreed to do the job, right? I mean, you needed a guy who would offer to lay down here. And apparently Bobo would do that for the Sheik. Not that they hadn't had 4,000 matches prior to this, but hey, it's another variation with Bobby Heenan and the Bruiser involved. And we've got one more match here. We talked about the AWA champion, Verne Gagne, scoring a win here over Billy Robinson. Count out of the ring. So Gagne going to retain the title. Goes over on a count out. Let's hear what they made.
Gagne, $3,300.
Okay.
Billy Robinson, $2,750.
$2,750. So close to what Verne made. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Very fair. Very fair.
Yeah. And you know what? The payoffs schedule, which was furnished to the Illinois State Athletic Commission for every card. There was a quarterly report to the Illinois State Athletic Commission, and there were some other people getting paid for that show, too, I thought I would bring up.
Oh, sure.
The AWA co-owner, Wally Carbo, came up for the card. He got paid $500. The Sheik's manager that night was Eddie Creechman. He got $500. WWA TV announcer, who, by the way, introduced one of the matches in the ring, Sam Medeker, got $300. And Mike Snyder got $100, as he was pretty new at the time. I think he was just a standby wrestler. If they had they would have a lot of these cards, a standby wrestler that would get a small payoff. Sometimes Mike was on a card, would be the ring truck driver. That would be part of his compensation.
Gotcha.
But I think on this card, they used an AWA ring. You could tell by the red, white, and blue ropes and the powder blue canvas. That's an example. By the way, the average ticket price was $6.38 if you divided attendance by gross box office for that.
Do we have the number? What they drew? I mean, I know we got to know how much they made. Do you know?
16,989 paid.
Wow. Okay. So they did pretty damn well there at Comiskey. That's a hell of a draw. There's about 17,000 fans out to see that show. And I'm gonna lie and tell myself that Bobby Heenan drew the card, but I mean, obviously up and down, another monster show. It's amazing how huge Chicago was, and a lot of people don't even realize it, right? I mean, just nobody really talks about it like they should. At this point, with all the sound bites we've listened to and everything in between, I think we've run the course for this episode, Richard.
Sure.
What I want to do is invite you back because we've got more cards to discuss. And I know you want to talk about, the latter days, the dying days of the Chicago territory. But on top of that, as long as, you have the free time, I would love to invite you back and start scrolling through these results and anything you remember, anything we can hit on, any matches, any angles, anything. I mean, just anything we can bring back to life for the fans, because this has been an amazing time thus far. I want to thank you again so much for the sound bites. A lot of people want to see the videos. They want to see HD, high definition, quality things but true wrestling fans, the historians, the super fans, the old school fans, in me, I remember growing up, if I could listen to something on an audio cassette, it came to life in my head. And that's what you did for me today, listening to these.
And thanks for that. And thanks for letting me share this.
Oh my
God. We're going to have some interesting sound bites coming up. Ooh. We're going to have Ox Baker. We're going to have Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel.
Love it.
And Bobby Heenan again. And unfortunately, we will have to discuss the gradual decline of the Chicago Wrestling Club. How it all ended, but, most wrestling that happens.
All good things must come to an end is what they say. However, we can keep this alive for as long as we want because we got over a decade of results here to plow through and discuss, and the talent that came in and out and the feuds and everything as we go on. But to run through this outline that you created for us first is just amazing. We've still got a couple of big shows to discuss here later in 1970s. And as you said, unfortunately, we'll talk about the demise and kind of see how that developed going into the 1980s. But it's been a pleasure to have you on for the first time.
Thank you.
Can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this and kind of spreading the story of Chicago wrestling history here on Regional Rasslin.
And I'm trying to generate enthusiasm for those who maybe watched Georgia or maybe were Mid-Atlantic fans or Mid-South, to give them a feel for what was happening in Chicago during these years.
And AWA fans may remember Chicago being a territory, if you will, but so they probably know perhaps Nick Bockwinkel and Verne Gagne and Ray Stevens and the like were in this Chicago area. But at the same time, there's a lot of people that might be latter AWA fans. They jumped on the bandwagon later in the history of wrestling, or maybe they just go back and watch it now. And now they have something to latch on to because a lot of these top talents that were working for Verne are working here. And of course, the Bruiser, Wilbur Snyder, and some of the top guys over there in WWA, which is also where Bobby Heenan got his start. So there's a lot of history here, just going back to Blackjacks and the Heenan feud, and so much to get into. So looking forward to continuing this ride next time around. Thank you so much again, Richard.
Thank you, Ray. I'm going to dig up some good stories and I'll go through those results. And this will be a nice chapter 2 for the Chicago Wrestling Club.